But we begin with Yoenis Cespedes as we take the lead. According to a New York Post report, looking more and more like Cespedes will aim for a 5-year deal this offseason. On a related note, from what we're hearing, the Mets want to stick to a 4-year deal if they can. And Jim, I ask you, is his fate this offseason dependent on getting that 5th year?
I think right now, I'm not 100% sure. I don't even know if they know the answer to that. Cespedes, I think, wants to stay here. Really, a lot of it, I think, is going to depend on his agent and his involvement. Last year, they didn't have an awful lot of choices, and they went to the Mets and said, you know what, if you can do this, he'll come back to the Mets. That's where he wants to go. Now, the agent has a history of trying to get the biggest amount of money. There's a lot of pressure from the union to try to get the highest dollar amount and not leave any money on the table. And I don't get the sense, guys, that the Mets are willing to go to that 5th year, at least right now. They might get pushed there, and because they need him so much more, they might be willing to do that. I think that part of it has changed a little bit after seeing him there for a full season. They really, they needed this guy, because if they don't get him, I don't like the other alternatives.
I think the Mets really won this last year because they waited him out, and they waited, and they got a great deal. Now they're dealing with, obviously, the opt-out situation. But if I'm the Mets, 5 years shouldn't be a deal breaker for me. We're not talking 7, 8 years, 10 years like we've seen some of these long-term deals that go bust in the end. You've got a window with these pitchers right now that's going to last 2 or 3 years. Even if you have to eat 1 or 2 on the back end of this, it's not a bad deal at all, Todd.
Well, I do believe that the Mets are going to probably need to get that 5th year to have a realistic opportunity to sign him. I think if I were the Mets, I think I would certainly look at that seriously. I think, as you pointed out, young pitching staff, but to even look 4 years into the future on young pitchers, so much can happen. So you can't really rely on that and say you're taking the money away from those guys potentially. But what I do think you have with Cespedes right now is, if you're the Mets, you've got a big hole to fill if he doesn't come back. And if that difference is that 5th year, then I say you got to go out and get him, because you still have the hole in your lineup that maybe David Wright does or doesn't fill. And I think that is a big key to whether or not they're going to stay aggressive with him.
And why, Jim, would an organization take a stand, an example like this, and say, we're not going to a 5th year? Is that a principle thing, or do they really, is that 1 year really, does that make that big of a difference?
I mean, they'll take us, listen, when I was back there, when we went and gave an extra year to Pedro Martinez, it was 4 years instead of 3, and he only pitched for 2.5. Billy Wagner came down with an injury and had Tommy John surgery, same type of deal, 4 years, ended up only doing 3. Like, those are the things that you worry about. Now, I don't worry as much about the injury factor from Cespedes, but listen, there are some issues, we know behind the scenes that, the personality is such that you worry about a little bit. Now, I'll say this, though, that's already discounted in the marketplace. So the market for a player like of his status and his stature and the impact that he has in the lineup, those guys last year, Hayward, Davis, all got 6, 7 years, that times 25 or whatever, was up in $160 million range. You're not talking about that for Cespedes. It's already being a discount of 4 or 5 years. So I think it's easily justifiable to go to that 5th year, even if it's a little bit uncomfortable. It's not a lot uncomfortable.
Yeah, I also think that the fans at home sometimes don't understand that when a team signs a player for 6, 7, 8 years, they're taking into consideration that the last couple of years of that contract may not be really worth that value, but they're taking that opportunity to get somebody on the front side that's going to have an impact, and then they can write that off on the other side.
And Todd,
I'm sorry, I think the Pedro deal that you were talking about is a perfect example. You knew you weren't getting 4 years out of him. You hoped for 2, and you could work with that window.
And Todd mentioned this earlier, Sweeney. I want to get your take, because a lot of Mets fans, when they hear that 5th year, maybe 6-year contracts, people talk about it, they do worry about that young starting pitching, thinking, well, that's around the time they're going to need to get paid. We're not going to be able to pay them because we're going to have Cespedes under contract. Why is that not something necessarily that should be considered in these negotiations?
I just don't think that they're looking at the idea that they're going to be able to sign all these guys or keep all these guys. Remember, these guys will have some value as they get closer to free agency and bring back a better return and kind of restock and reshuffle a little bit. I don't think the Mets have any, you might disagree with me, Jim, but I don't think the Mets have any illusions that they are going to stick with all these guys all the way through to free agency.
No, I agree with that. And I think that that's where they start to plug in some of the guys from their minor leagues in other positions. So you can afford the starters if Asdrubal Cabrera's not here at the end of 2018, because he has a club option that they'll likely pick up. When Neil Walker is on, you're going to plug in Ahmed Rosario. You're going to plug in guys from your system. Maybe a Dominic Smith comes and goes to play first base. You're going to find ways to afford the club and be able to keep those starting pitchers, the ones that you want. There's some others that you're you're not going to be able to keep. Like Harvey, as an example, is going to be hard to keep because he's represented by Scott Boras. But you can keep a couple of those guys if you want, and then you better develop some others.